Take a wind-up toy and turn the key until the spring is tight all the way, until it pushes back against your fingers. Set it on the table, and most of the time it runs across the surface. But every so often you set it down and nothing happens. It sits there, fully wound. Hold it to your ear and you can feel the tension inside it, the spring straining against something, and it does not move a millimeter. The energy is real, the spring is loaded, and somewhere inside one small gear, a gear with a single bent tooth, is holding all of that force perfectly still. I've come to believe that a great many capable people are that toy, not empty, not lazy, fully wound, straining, and completely still. And when this happens, the problem is almost never the size of the spring. The problem is one seized gear. There is a precise reason a single small part can hold back so much force, and once you see it, being stuck stops looking like a flaw in your character and starts looking like a diagnosis you can actually run. Here's the claim, and I want to lay it down plainly before I defend it. What pulls you toward an action or pushes you away from it in any given moment is not one quantity. It is the product of three, and because those three combine by multiplication and by addition, a near zero in any single one of them collapses the whole force, no matter how large the other two happen to be. Let me slow down on those three quantities because the argument lives inside them. The first is how much you actually value the outcome, whether the thing at the end is something you want or dread or feel almost nothing about. The second is whether you believe this particular action really leads to that outcome. You can want a promotion enormously and still somewhere underneath not believe that one more late night has anything to do with getting it. The third is whether you believe that you specifically can execute the action, not whether it works on other people, not whether it works in theory, whether your own hands can do the thing. These three are genuinely separate, and that is the part most of us blur. You can want the result and doubt the path. You can trust the path and doubt yourself. Wanting, believing the path works, and believing you can walk it are three different beliefs, and they can each be high or low independently of the other two. Now, the whole weight of the idea rests on one distinction: adding versus multiplying. If these three added together, then a single weak one would only lower your total a little. Your other strength would carry you across. A low score in one place would be a dent, not a wall. But if they multiply, a single near zero drags the entire product down to near zero with it. 10 times 10 times 0 is not a bit less than usual, it is 0. All the wanting in the world times all the trust in the world times a belief near zero that you can do the specific thing gives you a force near zero, a wound, spring, a table, and no motion. I think this matters especially now, and for a specific reason. We have been handed a very flat picture of motivation. Motivation as a single fuel gauge. Drive, discipline, want it more, push harder, get up earlier. So when we stall, we do the intuitive thing. We pour more into whichever tank is easiest to fill, which is almost always the tank that was already full. The person who deeply wants the thing tries to want it harder. The person who understands the path perfectly reads one more article about the path. And nothing moves because the term they are feeding was never the one that collapsed. And sometimes the flat picture is right. Sometimes you stall on something because you simply do not want it, and No formula is required to explain that. Sometimes the path you are on genuinely does not lead where you were told it leads, and your reluctance is accurate. I'm not going to pretend that every stall is a trick of the mind. Sometimes a low term is low because reality made it low, but very often when I look closely at a capable person who is stuck, 2 of the 3 terms are high, sometimes strikingly high, and 1 is sitting near the floor. And every ounce of effort is being spent on the 2 that were already fine. This structure is not something I invented. In 1964, the psychologist Victor Room formalized motivation almost exactly this way. He proposed that a force driving a behavior is a product of 3 things: expectancy, that effort will produce performance, then the instrumentality, that performance will actually produce the outcome, and valence, the value of that outcome. Force equals expectancy times instrumentality times valence, multiplied, not summed. And a decade later, Albert Bandura pulled apart the 2 beliefs I described, separating the belief that an action produces a result from the belief that you can perform the action in the first place. He called the second one self-efficacy, and he argued it innately predicts whether people even begin and whether they persist. A large meta-analysis by Stajkovic and Luthans, pooling over 100 studies, found a real and positive relationship between self-efficacy and performance. And going further back, Decky and Ryan's work on intrinsic motivation showed that valence, the value you attach to a task, is not a fixed trait, but something that shifts with meaning and context. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because researchers went after this model hard, and what they found looks at first like a crack in it. When Vanier and Thierry pooled the test in the 1990s, simply adding the 3 components predicted behavior roughly as well as multiplying did. For a while, you could read that as the multiplication being decoration. I read it as a clue, because when a clean multiplication refuses to show up in the data, the most common reason is not that the structure is wrong, it is that the model is missing a variable, and the arithmetic is absorbing the gap. And I think the missing variable has a name. Room's valence measures the value of the outcome, the thing waiting at the end, but the action itself carries a valence too. Every hour on the path is either something you would almost do for its own sake, or something that feels like dragging a sled through mud, and that second valence appears nowhere in his formula. It changes the arithmetic completely, because you are never buying the outcome alone. You are buying every hour it takes to get there. Decky and Ryan built half a career on this. When the doing itself carries value, people persist far past what any outcome calculation predicts, and it explains the exact cases that puzzled the researchers. Nobody at a slot machine is confused about the expected outcome. Activity pays them on every single pull, even while the outcome quietly robs them. The formula was never broken. One of its gears was simply hiding from the people measuring it. Put the 2 balances side by side, and every path you're on falls into one of 4 kinds. An enjoyable activity toward a poor outcome, the slot machine, which is why people cheerfully persist down roads that lead nowhere. A draining activity toward a poor outcome, which needs no analysis at all, drop it. A draining activity toward an outcome you genuinely want, and this one deserves a hard look, because most outcomes have more than one road to them, and a road that fits who you are will beat a road that fights you the whole way. And an enjoyable activity toward an outcome you value, which is the configuration worth engineering your life toward. How you deliberately raise the valence of any activity is a video of its own. What matters here is that the multiplication holds. The gear train is real. The textbook just drew one of its gears too small. And I know this shape from the inside, which is the only reason I trust it at all. When I was working to bring my book, Master Your Life script, and the app around it into the world, I stalled for a long time and I told myself a very flattering story about why. I told myself I needed more clarity, a cleaner plan, a better version. But when I finally ran these 3 terms honestly, the diagnosis was almost embarrassing. My valence was high. I wanted this badly. My belief that the work, if seen, could actually help someone was high too. I trusted the path. The term sitting near the floor was the third one, and it was narrow and specific. It was my belief that I could put a rough, unfinished version of my thinking in front of a few real people and survive their reaction. Not the abstract act of publishing, the precise act, because that one gear was seized. I could pour want and conviction into the machine forever and get no motion. What actually moved me was not more wanting. It was raising that single low term directly by showing a rough version to a small number of people while it was still cheap to be wrong and watching the feared consequence failed to arrive. The force did not return because I found more drive. It returned because I stopped feeding the terms that were already full. Which brings me to the spring and to a distinction I unpacked more fully in another video. Can you name the exact threshold that ends your waiting? A wound spring holds what physicists call potential energy, stored, ready, doing nothing. Motion, the toy actually crossing the table, is kinetic energy, and being stuck in the sense I keep meeting in myself and in other people is very rarely an empty spring. It is potential energy that cannot convert into kinetic energy because something in the mechanism between the two is holding. So picture the machine honestly. The wound springs everything you already have, your want, your intelligence, your ambition, your preparation, all of it, real and loaded and string. And between that spring and any actual movement sit 3 gears in a line, and they must all turn for the toy to run. One gear is what the thing is worth to you, the outcome at the end and the hours it costs to get there. The next is whether you believe this action reaches it. The last is whether you believe you can perform the action. In a train of gears, if any single one is seized, none of them turn. Not they turn slowly, they do not turn. The spring stays wound, and you can stand there insisting the spring is strong, and you would be right, and the toy still will not move because one gear with one bent tooth is absorbing the entire force of the spring and giving back nothing. That is what I want you to be able to do with this. When you find yourself wounded and still do not ask the flat question. Do not ask why you have no drive, because drive is the whole product. And the whole product tells you nothing about which part failed. Ask 3 narrow questions instead about the specific action you are avoiding. Do I actually value this outcome? And does the path itself feed me or drain me? Or have I been carrying someone else's idea of what I should want? Do I truly believe this action leads there? Or have I quietly lost faith in the path while pretending the problem is elsewhere? And do I believe that I specifically can perform this exact step? Run all 3. Usually, one of them answers much lower than the others. And often it is a surprise because we spend most of our attention defending and improving the 2 that were already high. I have to be careful here because a lens can lie to you if you let it. The formula tells you where the force is leaking. It does not tell you that the leaking term ought to be higher. Sometimes you find a near zero and it is telling the truth. Sometimes you believe that the action reaches the outcome is low because the action genuinely does not reach the outcome, and the honest move is to change the plan, not to inflate the belief. The way a gear train genuinely stops when one gear ceases. That part is non-negotiable. But the numbers you plug into each term are not laws, they are estimates. Many of them you inherited without checking, a point I make at length in most of your calendar was written by someone else, another video. So the work is not to force every low term upward. The work is to find the collapsed term and then ask one more question of it. Is this near zero true? Or is it just an old estimate I never tested? And this is where I think authorship actually lives, more than in any grand act of will. It is easy when you're wounded still to reach for the global verdict. I'm not disciplined. I am not the kind of person who follows through, or I do not have what it takes. That verdict feels like insight, but it is really the additive misreading dressed as self-knowledge because it treats the whole product as one broken thing about you. The multiplicative view says the opposite. The spring is fine, the want is real, and the failure is local, specific, and often a single term wide. Authorship is the decision to read the mechanism instead of accepting the verdict. To name which gear is seized, decide whether it is seized because the path is truly closed or only because you never once tested whether that tooth would give, and then, if it is only untested, to reach in and turn that one gear yourself with an action small enough to be cheap and real enough to count. So look at the toy again. Wound all the way, straining, still. It is not broken and its spring is not empty. One gear is holding everything. So the question I would leave you with is not how do I get more motivated? Because now you know that question is asking about the whole product and answering about nothing. The question is narrower and harder and more useful. Of the three, which single gear in you is seized right now, holding all of your wound up for still? And is it seized because the way forward is genuinely closed, or only because you have never once tested whether that one bent tooth would actually give?